Chief Guest Senator Mujahid Hussain Syed, Dr. Hassan Askari Rizvi, Pro-Rector Professor Dr. Hamid Naveed, Professor Dr. Khalid Mahmoud Bhatt, academics, faculty, students, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all of you. It's an honor to have been invited to speak here today in Lahore, and a great pleasure to speak here today at this important conference bringing together scholars and practitioners entitled Contemporary Challenges for Democracy 2025. The organizers invited me to present some views as a representative of a country that they described in the brief that they sent me as, and I quote, "A social democratic country which possesses a stable and exemplary system of governance, often seen as a role model for others to follow." End quote. This is a generous characterization for which I am grateful. And at one level, it is not wrong. Norway consistently ranks among the world's most robust democracies in a range of international surveys and indexes. These rankings reflect strong institutions, high levels of political trust, and respect for civil liberties. In the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, Norway has ranked first globally for several years, with perfect marks in categories such as electoral process and pluralism, political participation, and political culture. The Varieties of Democracy project classifies Norway as a liberal democracy with a very high democratic quality. And according to Freedom House, Norway scores 100 out of 100 in its annual Freedom in the World report, reflecting full political rights and civil liberties. Crucially, of course, as the previous keynote speaker already touched on, this state of perfect democracy, and kindly note the quotation marks, did not arrive overnight. Evolving and nurturing a democratic system of government takes time with setbacks along the way. Success is never assured. In my country's case, it has taken more than 2 centuries since the dissolution of Danish absolutist rule, a form of colonialism, in 1814, to establish and perfect the democratic institutions we have today. More than 2 centuries. And although liberal for its time in an international comparative perspective, our Constitution of 1814 contained distinctly illiberal elements, including restrictions on voting rights based on property and gender, a ban on Jews entering the country, and limits on the freedom of religion and press. Full independence was achieved for Norway in 1905, and gradual democratic reforms, including universal suffrage, followed over the next decades. Women obtained the right to vote in 1913. The post-World War II era saw the development of the modern welfare state, supported by a strong labor movement and broad political consensus. Today, our democracy remains a work in progress. Recent assessments point to challenges also with Norwegian democracy, such as unequal political participation, social basis in party recruitment, and public perceptions of undue elite influence. Concerns have also been raised about the limited use of direct democracy and the impact of online harassment on political engagement. Several factors arguably help explain Norway's relatively successful democratic journey. The country's strong social contract, anchored in broad political consensus and low economic inequality, have fostered trust in institutions and public life. A well-developed welfare state, combined with high levels of education and press freedom, have underpinned civic participation. Moreover, the absence of internal or colonial conflicts during state formation allowed democratic norms to take root without deep societal cleavages. You could say that getting things right might be easier in a country with a relatively small and homogeneous population. The population of Norway today is 5.6 million. Any given country's journey towards democracy is not necessarily one way. Democratic rule can and does unravel. No country is entirely immune in this regard. A recent expert survey estimated the probability of a democratic breakdown in Norway within the next decade at around 10%. Low, but not negligible. In some countries in Europe, we have witnessed clear democratic backsliding. Authoritarian tendencies have grown, not through military coups, but through the gradual erosion of checks and balances by democratically elected leaders. Hungary and formerly Poland are key examples. The backsliding is often insidious and creeping. Institutions once seen as bulwarks, courts, media, civil society, are gradually being undermined or co-opted. Minority rights are slowly downgraded or even set aside on the basis of majoritarianism. Laws are passed that stifle NGOs under the guise of anti-terror or national security measures. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 represents one of the most serious threats to democracy and freedom, not only in Europe, but anywhere in decades. It is a fundamental challenge to the rules-based international order and the idea that sovereign nations and their citizens have the right to choose their own democratic path. Of course, the aggression is deeply connected to the authoritarian nature of the Russian regime, where internal repression and external aggression reinforce one another. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its broader conduct illustrates the danger posed by certain autocracies that seek to undermine democratic norms both at home and abroad. These include disinformation campaigns targeting elections, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, attempts to destabilize neighboring states through proxy conflicts, and the repression of independent media and political opposition domestically. Democracy is not only a core value in Norwegian society. Respecting and promoting democracy are also integral to our foreign policy. The policy platform of the Norwegian government today outlines the following priorities. The government will pursue a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and respect for democratic development. And democracy and human rights shall be an integrated part of our foreign and development policy. This priority reflects both moral conviction and strategic interest. It is in our national interest, we believe, to contribute to stability and predictability in the world. And respect for international law, democratic values, including rule of law and human rights, are key elements in achieving this. Practically, we seek to support democratic governance through a combination of diplomacy, development assistance, and institutional cooperation. This includes strong backing for the rule of law, civil society, and free media elsewhere in Europe and beyond, including through multilateral organizations such as the UN, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. By now, it will be clear to all of you that I have been using the term democracy in a rather broad, encompassing sense. In the academic literature, there is an abundance of definitions ranging from the very minimalist to the quite maximalist. I will avoid the debates about the correct definition and instead confine myself to the definition that my own government offered in a white paper from earlier this year on the promotion of democracy in Europe. And I quote, "Democracy is about more than holding free and fair elections. It also concerns the rule of law, separation of powers, protection of minorities and individuals, freedom for civil society and the media, and an open and informed public discourse." I contend that this is a robust working definition that works well in the 21st century to describe a form of governance that holds wide appeal across the globe. Research shows that even though there are some indications of decline in support for democracy across the world, especially among younger parts of the population, even in non-democratic countries, citizens remain relatively positive towards democracy. A Gallup international survey published in June 2024 found that 59% of people in 43 countries, representing half of the global population, agreed that democracy was the best form of government. At the same time, research has also shown that some respondents globally are open to military rule, technocracy, or strongman leadership. The Economist argues in the Democracy Index report for 2024 that public dissatisfaction with democracy has been growing across high-income established democracies in recent years. They see three causes for this: declining trust in government, the failure of politicians and political parties to represent voters effectively, and a civic and representation deficit. The Economist continues. These factors have led to disillusionment with democratic institutions and contributed to rising populism, political disengagement, and increasing political polarization. One interpretation would be that support for democracy can be shallow and conditional, particularly when democratic institutions fail to deliver tangible outcomes or are perceived as corrupt or unresponsive. As such, the credibility of democracy can be said to be tied to performance, not just principle. But the same arguably can be said about any form of government. Performance always matters. Having said that, I want to contend that both as an ideal and as practice, reasonably well-functioning democratic government remains normatively superior to all other alternatives by a wide margin. Ruled by men in uniform or priests, by unelected party officials or colonial or neo-colonial technocrats, hereditary family dynasties, plutocratic oligarchs or feudal landowners, to mention some of the alternatives to the democratic form of government, they all produce their own pathologies that are worse than those of democracy, by and large. And they all fail the basic, but also very important test of moral and ethical legitimacy, I would argue. Moral and ethical legitimacy, some of you might say, empty words from the West. A West whose stock in trade, if one is to judge by what passes for commentary and analysis in much of the Pakistani media, is hypocrisy and double standards. I would agree that there are double standards at work in many capitals, but I would contend also that the so-called West holds no monopoly in this regard. Far from it, in fact. And this is what so much of Pakistani commentary chooses to overlook, in my view. I would also contend that this sort of facile whataboutism is a way of avoiding that fundamental, even if awkward, question about legitimacy. Only the archetype or theoretical ideal of democracy offers a broadly satisfactory response to this question of legitimacy, I submit. This is because democracy is the only form of government grounded in the principle of political equality, that each person, regardless of wealth, status, or other background, possesses an equal claim to say in how they are governed, Proponents of other systems may claim for them efficiency or order, but such systems inevitably entrench hierarchies of power that are inconsistent with the idea that all individuals are equal in dignity and worth. And that is why they are defective. I actually don't think this is a very controversial statement. I think it's pretty obvious, actually. And few non-democratic regimes or leaders explicitly disavow the ideal of democracy. Instead, one hears a lot of talk about how each country, each democracy, is a product of unique historical and geographical circumstances and centuries of political culture, and has its unique path to travel. This is, of course, analytically true at one level. But all too often such arguments become lazy or self-serving excuses to justify the unjustifiable. Gross economic and social inequality, discrimination and denial of the rights of minorities in the name of a majority rule or extremist interpretations of religion, and the suppression of the voices of the poor, uneducated, and dispossessed in pursuit of the self-interest of the few. This, of course, is not an inevitable state resulting from historical contingencies, but a willed or allowed result flowing from the politics of privilege and a failure of the moral compass and or political will of political leaders. There is a better way of doing it. The how of doing it better is not that complicated. We actually know quite a lot about what works to protect and build better democracies and prevent their erosion. One succinct summary of how is to be found in a document titled The Reykjavik Principles for Democracy, passed by the heads of state and government of the members of the Council of Europe at its summit in Iceland in May 2023. Iceland, home of the world's oldest parliament. I do not have the time to read the full argument here, but let me briefly mention the 10 principles this document enshrines. Ensure free and fair elections with universal suffrage and equal voting rights. Guarantee freedom of expression, including media freedom, pluralism, and access to information. Protect freedom of assembly and association, including for civil society and political parties. Uphold judicial independence and the rule of law. Safeguard the separation of powers and effective checks and balances. Prevent corruption and promote transparency and accountability in public life. Combat discrimination and protect the rights of minorities and vulnerable groups. Promote active citizenship, democratic culture, and civic education. Ensure democratic oversight of digital technologies and protect democratic discourse online. Strengthen multilateralism and international cooperation to defend and promote democracy. The principles are simple, building consensus around them and implementing them less straightforward. Nevertheless, and I'm going in for landing now, you will be pleased to hear, the principles provide useful practical benchmarks against which to judge the rhetoric and politics of governments in practice, I would submit. Policies and legislation that do not conform with these principles can reasonably be judged to fall short of democratic standards, no matter the often contorted rhetoric that will be used to justify them. And if they do not conform with these principles, quite straightforward principles to apply, such policies and legislation lack justification. If it does not walk like a democracy or talk like a democracy, it is not a democracy and should be called out for not being so. This is the case everywhere, including in Pakistan. Thank you for your attention.